Welcome to Washburn University's YouTube channel. I'm Danielle Dempsey-Swopes, the Director of University Diversity and Inclusion at Washburn University. Thank you for joining us tonight. This evening's program is a part of our community effort to bring programs that are focused on voting and voting literacy. We are excited to host this evening's presentation and panel discussion with scholar and author, Dr. Carol Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Her 2018 book entitled One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy details her research on voter suppression and brings to light the historical evidence of systemic voter suppression in the United States. Dr. Anderson is adamant that the right to vote is as fundamental to our democracy as the First Amendment right to speak without government interference. While Dr. Anderson is a scholar and a historian, she is also a human rights activist and civil rights advocate for the dismantling of state action and public policy that systemically undermines the way in which Black and Indigenous people of color access the right to vote. Dr. Anderson is also the author of the 2016 award-winning New York Times bestseller, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. This book calls on every one of us to confront the legacy of structural racism as a threat to each of us as citizens and as a threat to the future of our democracy. Tonight's lecture and panel discussion is sponsored by funding from the Washburn University Student Government Association. And support for the program comes from the Office of Student Life and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Now, joining Dr. Anderson this evening for discussion are our wonderful Washburn University faculty, and I'll quickly introduce them now before we get underway. Dr. Bob Beatty is chair of the Washburn University Political Science Department. He teaches classes on the American state and presidential elections, and he also studies communist and post-communist societies such as North Korea, China, and Cambodia. You've probably seen Dr. Bob Beatty on TV. He's the political analyst for KSNT TV. He writes a monthly column for Gannett newspapers in Kansas. He receives a grant to travel to Iowa and observe all 20 Democratic presidential candidates and wrote profiles of each candidate. Currently, he's teaching a course at Washburn on the 2020 presidential election. We also have this evening Dr. Steve Hageman. He teaches courses in the Center for Student Success and Retention at Washburn University. His academic background is in 20th century American history. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he studied race, housing, neighborhood change, and community organizing in post-war Chicago. He's taught classes in American history, African American history, sport in American history, and the history of conservatism, liberalism, and radicalism in the 20th century. We also have Dr. James Jim Schnoebelen. He is professor in communication studies at Washburn. He serves as the Communication Studies Department Chair and the Program Director for the Masters in Communication and Leadership degree. He has degrees in speech communication from Central Missouri State University and Communication Studies. His 2010 PhD had an emphasis in political communication and rhetoric from the University of Kansas. His scholarship also focuses on the US presidency, particularly in the ways in which political communication represents and reinforces the gendered nature of human communication and our notions of executive leadership. If you have a comment or a question for our speaker or panelist, please put those in our chat, as we may have time for a few questions at the end of our program. Thank you all very much for tuning again. And Dr. Anderson, we're ready for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I have been looking forward to this for a long time. And as you know, we're all in the middle of this incredible election season. We've got an election going on that is like none other right now. And I want to thank you for taking this election so seriously, for being engaged in the question and the need for the right to vote. And so when I think about the right to vote, I'm going to start off, I'm just going to do a brief overview, historical overview, because I'm a historian. And then I'm going to move us into this moment where Mark Twain apocryphally said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. And so we're going to talk about some of those rhymes. And when we often think about massive disfranchisement of the Black population, we often think of the violence that rained down on them. We think of like Maceo Snipes, who was a Black veteran, World War II veteran, who came home to Georgia in 1946. And there was an election happening in Georgia, and it was a gubernatorial election. And one of the men running was Eugene Talmadge. And Talmadge was running on a platform, you keep them right where they belong. Because World War II had created enormous energy about the fight for democracy, the fight for rights. And Maceo Snipes had that fight. And he was determined to vote. And he's like, I fought fascist. What do you have? And so he went to vote in Taylor County, Georgia. And there was a sign over the door that said something to the effect of, the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. Maceo looked at that sign and went, I fought fascist. And he went in and he cast his ballot. And he walked out. Nothing. It's like, okay. He goes home for several days, nothing. And then one day there's a knock on the door. Maceo goes out, steps on his porch. He's like, yeah. And there were 4 white men. And then the next thing he heard was, and it was a firing squad. And they laid Maceo out. He died. And the message was really clear in Taylor County, Georgia. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. That is how we conceptualize voter suppression, massive disfranchisement, from the physical violence raining down on Black folk. But I want to talk about another kind of violence, bureaucratic violence. The policies and the laws that create civic death, that eviscerate the right to vote. And although I'm a historian, I'm not going to take us all the way back. I'm going to start with the Mississippi Plan of 1890, because Mississippi was massively concerned about the number of African Americans who were registered to vote, who were politically involved, politically engaged, and Mississippi said, oh, we got to stop this. But they couldn't write a law that said, we don't want Black folk to vote, because the 15th Amendment says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So Mississippi's like, yeah, we can't write a law saying we don't want Black folk to vote, but we don't want Black folk to vote. And then Mississippi said, oh, but we got it. We've got it. What we're going to do is we're going to use the legacies of slavery and make those legacies the access to the ballot box. And we're going to make it all sound legitimate by talking about trying to stop massive, rampant voter fraud, by trying to stop corruption at the ballot box, by trying to say we are here for the integrity of our elections, to protect the integrity of our elections. That's all we're doing. And we're going to do it in ways, again, that sound legitimate. So we're going to say, you know, elections are expensive. You've got all of these poll workers who have to take the ballots and count the ballots and places. And so we don't think it's too much to ask for you to pay a small fee, a poll tax, in order to be able to vote. Now, there are 2 things that happen there. One is that it puts the onus solely on the citizen for running smooth, clean, fair elections. The second thing that it does is that it looks at a people who have endured hundreds of years of unpaid labor, followed by the Black codes after the Civil War, followed by sharecropping. We have systemic endemic poverty. The poll tax required 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income to vote. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income every year to vote. And the poll tax was cumulative. So if it took you 20 years to be able to do it, you owe 20 years of back poll taxes before you could vote. Then there's the literacy test. And again, it's going to sound reasonable. And the literacy test says, you know, we really want an engaged, informed electorate. One who knows our value systems, the foundational principles of our beautiful, wonderful government. And so we don't think it's too much to ask for them to be able to read a section of the Constitution. Well, when the enslaved were killed because they knew how to read, then followed after the Civil War with the massive underfunding of Black schools. So much so that by the time we would get into the 1940s, over half of all Black adults in Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama had less than 5 years of Jim Crow education. But that's the foundation upon which we are now asking a people to read as if they had a Harvard JD. And there were a series of these measures in this Mississippi plan, because it was like, if the poll tax doesn't get them, then the literacy test will. If the literacy test doesn't get them, grandfather clause. If it's not the grandfather clause, then it's going to be the understanding clause. If not the understanding clause, then it's going to be the good character clause. And then South Carolina added in the white primary. All of these things were barriers, hurdles to jump over and to crawl through and to fight through. In 1898, the US Supreme Court in the Williams decision ruled that the poll tax and the literacy test did not violate the 15th Amendment because everybody had to pay the tax and because everybody had to read. Although not everybody had dealt with hundreds of years of chattel slavery and all of the legacies emanating from that. The poll tax and the literacy test mixed with the violence were so powerful that by 1940, as the US is really looking at it, there's a world war going on and the Nazis are having a field day. Only 3% of Black adults in the South were registered to vote. 3%. This is how you gnarl a democracy, because you don't have representative government anymore. You have those who are absolutely beholden to a small strata of folk. And the governance reflects that. This is what leads to the civil rights movement and the cataclysm on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which gives us the Voting Rights Act. What was so phenomenal about the Voting Rights Act was that it required states that had a demonstrated history of discriminating against its American citizens, against its population, to have every law dealing with voting approved first, something called pre-clearance, before that law could get implemented, before it could strangle and cauterize the electorate. Pre-clearance worked. Now understand, it was a contentious battle. It wasn't one of those, it was all over but the shouting kind of things, because that's not America. but it was a contentious battle. But what it meant was in early 1960, only 5% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote. 5% in Mississippi. But 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, almost 60% were registered to vote. Then I'm going to fast forward to 2013 and the Shelby County v. Holder decision, where the US Supreme Court gutted the preclearance provision, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Almost immediately afterwards, states pounced on implementing racially discriminatory laws. Texas, 2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, implemented a voter ID law. And one of the ways that the voter ID law seems to be as race neutral as the poll tax or as the literacy test, it plays to a middle class norm that everybody has an ID. So, and we've got to stop all of this massive, rampant voter fraud. Remember when I said history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme? This is the language that we're hearing from 1890. But voter fraud, and we will talk about this in the panel, is a fiction. That has been created to scare the American people into believing that there are things we need to do to protect our ballots, to protect our elections. And what these legislatures have done is to identify the types of IDs African Americans have and don't have, and then write the laws to remove those that Black people have in abundance from being eligible to vote. For instance, in Alabama took a day to implement its law after Shelby County v. Holder. Republican legislators had actually recorded themselves saying, how do we depress the Black voter turnout? Because all of these Aborigines and these illiterates will get on these HUD-financed buses and go to the polls. That is the ideological framework that is governing the way that the Alabama legislature then wrote the law. And it said you've got to have a government-issued photo ID. But public housing ID doesn't count. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund looked up and said, wait, you said government-issued photo ID. Alabama's a poor state. 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African Americans. And for many, it was the only government-issued photo ID they had. And now that didn't count. And that was then followed up by Governor Bentley shutting down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. That's requiring people to go over to the next county to try to get a driver's license. But if you don't have a driver's license, you can't drive. And if you can't drive, then how do you go over to the next county to get the driver's license that you need in order to be able to vote? This is the bureaucratic violence that I'm talking about. How we don't see the bloodshed, but systematically removing millions of American citizens, African Americans, from their eligibility, from their right to vote. And this, just like Mississippi, there are an array of different programs. There's the voter ID laws. There's the poll closures. There are the voter roll purges. There are the cutting of the days in early voting. And then there's extreme partisan gerrymandering. All of those combine to cauterize, to weaken American democracy. And I liken it to We have policies. If we have policies where only sopranos can sing, imagine a choir with only sopranos. It also means that your songbook can only have songs meant for the sopranos. Now imagine a choir that has basses and baritones and altos and tenors, as well as the sopranos. Then you have a really rich, thick songbook, and you have a much more vibrant, incredible sound. That is the democracy we have to fight for. And I'm going to leave it there because I know we're getting ready to have a great conversation.
Dr. Beatty, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. First of all, Carol, these two books are fantastic. Fantastic research and scholarship and everything. I really commend you for that.
Thank you.
A couple things. One is I was an election observer in Mongolia, and the government of Mongolia actually took it upon itself to register every citizen. It was the government's duty. It was on them to register their citizens. And so that was a nice experience for me. But I know it's not lost upon you that you're doing this with a university from Kansas, of course. And I'm really struck by the term you're using of bureaucratic violence. And I'm interested in your thoughts, because Kansas does not have a large African-American community, but we, of course, Kansas featured a Secretary of State who used the idea, and you already mentioned it with Mississippi, of illegal immigrants voting.
Yes.
To get people, I guess, enough voters to vote him in, and then pass laws requiring birth certificates, photo IDs that in other states are going to have a huge impact upon the African-American community. And you do almost wonder if, and he was later appointed to Trump's voter fraud commission.
Yes, he was.
And so, you know, was it a way to say, well, you know, for southern states or other states to say, well, Kansas has this law, so it's really nothing to do with African Americans. It's about, as you mentioned, voter integrity. So were this fear of illegal immigrants voting a stalking horse, do you think, for other groups not being able to vote?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it's one of the things, I mean, I'm here in Georgia, you know, so I'm deep South. And so you get the fear of, you have this thing about all of these non-citizens voting. And so we've got to protect our elections for American citizens. But you also have the ways that the laws have also targeted African Americans, and they've targeted Asian Americans, and they've targeted Hispanic Americans. I mean, it is across the board. And the way that it works is that, you know how I talked about each of those mechanisms of voter suppression now in the 21st century, is that one or two of those, some combination, goes after what I have called the Obama coalition. And that is in 2008, as we know, Obama was elected to the presidency. And the narrative goes that the vast majority of whites elected Barack Obama, and the United States crossed the racial Rubicon. We have overcome. Well, not quite accurate. The majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And that includes sons of the South, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. So then the question becomes, well, then how did Obama get in there? Well, he had an incredible grassroots ground game that brought millions of new voters to the polls. They were overwhelmingly African American, Asian American, Hispanic, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. So there are ways that the voter roll purges go after young folks and go after poor folk. There are ways that voter ID goes after African Americans. There are ways that poll closures goes after Hispanic voters and goes like the shutting down of the poll or the moving of the polling station in Dodge City. Right? There are ways, so each of these methods really goes after one of those members of the, what I call the Obama coalition, because that was like, oh, we have got to stop this. And so the stalking horse of immigration, of immigrants, is part and parcel of this larger fear of a really diversifying America and what that means for our politics, for our institutions, and for our laws. Yeah.
Just a very quick follow-up, and then of course we'll have more questions. In Kansas, before Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State was considered a sleepy job. I mean, yeah, we had one or two that became governor, but it was very bureaucratic. The Secretaries of State actually prided themselves on increasing voter registration. No joke. They'd run for re-election saying, I increased voter registration. And of course, having no problems, clean elections. And then Kobach changed all that, and it sort of surprised people. I mean, so it was almost like an under the radar thing. So Kobach didn't run for US Senate, governor. That's all later. He runs for a relatively sleepy position, but as you're pointing out, that has lots of incredible power, bureaucratic power. So that was actually, I hate to say this, but almost a wise move if your intent is to get in there, then to make all these changes.
You know, it's like how I called the Mississippi Plan of 1890 legislative evil genius. I mean, so to be able to craft laws that can slide through, that are targeted. I mean, Jim Big Chief Vardaman, who would eventually become governor of Mississippi, he said the only reason we changed our Constitution was to remove from politics. Now, if that's the only reason you changed your Constitution, but what you tell everybody else, including the Supreme Court, is that you're just trying to clean up the elections, and the Supreme Court goes, okay, then maybe they said it more fluently than okay, but that is about it. I mean, and it's the same thing. I mean, Kobach, in an interview with Ari Berman, actually said, well, yeah, basically this is a sleepy position, but it holds inordinate power, because in that position, you can shape the electorate, which means you can shape who wins and who loses. You can shape who has access to the ballot box and who doesn't. Again, I'm in Georgia. I had Brian Kemp, who, yeah, I can see Steve is like, okay, I got to hop in here on this one. I saw it. Bring it.
No, you can finish up. I have another question about something else happening. So, but I appreciate your thoughts about Brian Kemp. So,
well, Brian Kemp, when you think about how absolutely unethical it is to be the Secretary of State managing the election in which you are running for governor in, and that allows you to do all kinds of stuff. So in 2018, in this 2018 election, he removed over 10% of all registered voters from Georgia's rolls. And that election, I mean, statistically, this thing is tied with Stacey Abrams.
right.
And so in October, what he did using one of the purge mechanisms called exact match, which says that your voter registration card has to match exactly the information that is in the state's driver's license database or in the database of the Social Security Administration. And so if your last name is Garcia Marquez and you write it with a hyphen, but there's no hyphen in the state's database, your voter registration is kicked out. If your name is Renee and you write it with an accent over the E, but there's no accent in the state's database, your name is kicked out. Your voter registration is kicked out. In those 53,000 that he removed, fewer than 10% were white. 70% were African American. The month before the election. Yeah. Yeah. It's something seeing it unfold and not seeing the kinds of ethical, normative, or legal guardrails that prevent someone from managing their own election and doing it in ways that can disadvantage their opponent and privilege them.
So, can I go ahead?
Yes.
Dr. Harris, I was wondering, when you were kind of going through the list of the ways in which kind of these policies and procedures kind of work to disenfranchise people today. I think the one thing maybe you talked about in your book, but you didn't mention when you're going through that list, and I want you to maybe talk a little bit about it, is the role of mass incarceration, all the way from legislative apportionment, right? So that when people are imprisoned, the neighborhoods in which they are from lose the opportunity for legislative apportionment, and they're counted in the rural, largely white counties where those prisons are located, all the way then through the process of felon disenfranchisement. And maybe you could even talk a little bit about Florida. I mean, Florida is going to be such a pivotal state in this election, and what's gone on in the last few years. You could talk about that. Kind of the citizens of Florida tried to restore former felon voting rights. It's been tried to be undermined. So if you could talk about the role of mass incarceration.
So so I'm going to start historically. In 1867, I told you way back, in 1867, Congress passed, the radical Republicans. I love that term because it seems like cognitive dissonance now, but the radical Republicans passed the 1867 Reconstruction Act. And what that act did is, in addition to several other things, it provided for Black men to have the right to vote. That was 1867. In 1868, early 1868, Florida passes its felon disfranchisement law that says if you have been convicted of a felony, you have lost your right to vote. And then what Florida did was it crafted a series of laws in its criminal justice system that were only applicable to African Americans, or B, were only enforced against African Americans. And felon disfranchisement in Florida was permanent. So, and Florida became one of only 4 or 5 states in the nation that had permanent felony disfranchisement, which meant once you had a felony conviction, you couldn't vote. You'd lost your rights. And so even if you had a felony conviction in Ohio, where you can get your rights back after your sentence is over, if you move to Florida, you lost your right to vote permanently. So what happened by the time we get to 2018, remember 1868, by the time we get to 2018, there are over 6 million Americans who cannot vote because of a felony conviction. 1.7 million of them are in Florida alone. 40% of Black men in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of the Black adult population in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. Yet, when the census would come along, those people would be counted for the representation algorithm about how many representatives in Congress Florida would get. So you have something worse than the 3/5 clause. You've got we're going to count you as a human being, but you have no say whatsoever in your government. None. Well, people mobilized because it just struck them wrong that after somebody has served their sentence, they have paid their debt to society, the kind of civic death that permanent felony disfranchisement does harms society. The measure, Amendment 4, passed by about 65% of the vote. Florida's legislature and its Governor Ron DeSantis looked up, I hope this isn't a cultural reference that's too old, but it was like Fred Sanford, who clutched his heart talking about Lisbeth, I'm coming. I mean, the fear of what it meant to have 1.4 million people get their voting rights back struck fear into the hearts of the Republican legislature. So they had to figure out what we're going to do. And so I'm now getting ready to mix cultural references. It was like a Scooby-Doo moment. So it was, whoa, Shaggy. And what they came up with was, okay, so it says they get to vote after they have completed their sentence. So what we're going to do is to say that the completion of their sentence requires the payment of all court fees, fines, and restitution. Well, this is beginning to smell like a poll tax because your wallet, your wealth is determining your access to the ballot box. Because we don't say if people don't pay their property taxes, they can't vote. We don't say if people don't pay their income taxes, they can't vote. But now we've got this dollar amount hanging on folks saying you've got to pay before you can vote. So of course this goes up to the court. About 2-3 weeks ago, the 11th Circuit, and I really hope everybody's sitting down, ruled that no, this wasn't a poll tax. In fact, this is constitutional. It is a part of their sentence, so they have to pay it. And the state of Florida does not have to tell them how much they owe.
They don't even know all the time. They don't even have records half the time of some of these things either.
Exactly. So what you get is this horrific amalgamation of the poll tax from the days of old. You've got to pay to vote. And the literacy test, where the state will ask you an absolutely unanswerable question. You know, so like Mississippi was notorious. If somebody could really go through all of the steps of the Constitution, then the question was, well, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? An absolutely unanswerable question. A man who was part of my community growing up in Ohio, who helped raise me, he grew up in Georgia. And he said that his literacy test question was, how high is up? This is what we're doing in 2020 when we're saying you must pay in order to vote, but we don't have to tell you how much you owe. So again, you see the state being able to abdicate its responsibility, just the way it abdicated its responsibility in terms of proper education for the literacy test, just the way it abdicated its responsibility for being able to provide the kinds of support for labor to be able to get paid adequately. The abdication of responsibility, but the sole responsibility on the citizen to figure this thing out.
Right, and then when Mike Bloomberg came in to try to pay some of these fines, they put up all kinds of, we're gonna put all kinds of roadblocks up. And when they asked how much these fines are, you can't even tell the Bloomberg money where the fines are to be paid, how much is it, and
right. So the state has no responsibility for setting up the mechanism to meet what it's saying must be done. And we are in October in a key election, and Florida is a key state. And the estimates are about 800,000 returning citizens are not able to vote because of this mess. 800,000. I mean, that's the stuff that elections are made of. And when you block automatically 800,000 people from the voting rolls. So when I talk about voter suppression, how it is destroying our democracy, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Thank you for that question, Steve.
Is it my turn, Danielle? Hi, Carol.
Hi, Jim.
I want to thank you first of all for your research. I think it's exceptionally well supported, and you really have that gift that is worth its weight in gold when you find it in a historian for making history come alive, which also incredibly increased my blood pressure for the past couple of weeks. So thanks for that. As a communication scholar, I'm very concerned with words. And one angle of disenfranchisement that I want to talk about is kind of this, what Richard Weaver would call this use of God terms or God phrases, where we talk about the sanctity of the ballot box and protecting our society against fraud and ensuring our rights to vote and maintaining election integrity. And these are words and phrases that are very difficult to combat in some kind of meaningful way if you aren't in on the research and know the full story. And so I guess my question to you is, how do we help explain this to everybody else so that we can, kind of make this beginning to correct these issues? How do we combat these words?
And so the genesis of this book is after the November 2016 election. And I'm listening to the pundits, and they're saying, whew, well, as we're looking at these numbers, Black people just didn't show up. They just weren't feeling Hillary because, she's Hillary. And, she's just not Obama, and Black people aren't going to vote for somebody who's not Obama. And I mean, there was so much wrong in those narratives, but part of what was just enraging me was that this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And to act like the 7% decline in Black voter turnout was absolutely divorced from the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, as these states are eagerly implementing voter ID laws, closing polling places, so that we know for every 1/10 of a mile that a polling place is closed in the Black community up to 4 miles, Black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%. So you can affect up to a 20% drop in Black voter turnout simply by moving the polls. But these narratives of, well, Black folks just didn't show up. And I knew that as I was listening, that I had to do something. And so what I decided to do was to reveal the magic trick. Part of the way that this thing works is that it looks legitimate. It looks rational. It looks like it is foundational to the protection of American democracy. And so I wanted to pull back the veil. You know, it's almost like, and I promise I'm not doing this because this is Kansas, but it's almost like looking behind the curtain and seeing the little guy. I am the Wizard of Oz. You know, and I wanted to show the little guy pulling the big levers, because once that happens, the whole mystification of it begins to crumble away, and you see how it's really done. And that's what I set out to do. So to lay out that language about voter roll purges, for instance, you know, we must maintain our voter rolls. And it's like one of those things, well, who could be against maintaining voter rolls? Who could be against removing dead people from the rolls? This is logical. Who could be against people who have moved out of the state no longer being on another state's voting rolls? Again, it's logical. But Lord, when you pull back the curtain, you see how the trick is really done. And you realize it has nothing to do with dead people on the rolls. It has nothing to do with people who have moved out of the district. It is about how can we remove the voters that we don't want. I think of Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. And he gave a talk in 1980. And he said, you know, I'm looking at all of you, and all of you are goo-goos. You believe in good government because you want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote because candidly, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. When you see that frame and begin to apply it to these purges. So let's take Chris Kobach's cross-check. So again, it looks seamless because Americans love the kind of sense of race neutral data, right? The big data machines, and it just feels like you don't have all of that in there. It's just a computer figuring it out. Well, so what Crosscheck said was that it was about stopping all of this massive rampant voter fraud, people hopping from state to state, registered to vote, voting and stealing our elections. And so what it said it was going to do was to match up first name, I think middle initial maybe, last name, suffix, last four of your social security, and date of birth. And if that combination was in Kansas and in Virginia, boom, kicked off the rolls because this was a cheat. I mean, that language again is about that protection. We've got people trying to steal our democracy. Well, actually the way Crosscheck worked was that most of them really didn't bother with social security numbers at all, nor did they bother with date of births, nor did they bother with the suffixes of junior or senior or the third. They kind of sort of looked at first name, but Joseph looked like Jose. He really honed in on the last name. And in America, minorities are overrepresented in 85 of the top 100 most common last names in this nation. So when you hone in on the last name, you can begin to remove minorities from the voting rolls. And that's what happened. So African Americans, let me back up again. So last names. If your last name is Washington, there's almost a 90% chance that you're African American. If your last name is Hernandez, over a 90% chance that you're Hispanic. If your last name is Kim, over a 90% chance that you're Asian American. So in these purges, African Americans were overrepresented by 45%. Asian Americans overrepresented by 31%. Hispanics overrepresented by 24%. Whites underrepresented by 8%. This is how you can craft an electorate, by looking clinical and by using the language of stopping massive rampant voter fraud and protecting the integrity of the ballot box. And so, as I said, I set out, and there are several of us, to explain the lie of voter fraud to begin with, and then to demystify these so-called race-neutral protective measures, to show how, in fact, they're actually racially discriminatory and racialized. That then allows us to have a very different kind of conversation about what it takes to truly protect our democracy. And I think that what that means is it requires that as many of us vote and participate. Because when you have a population, or vast swaths of the population that feel alienated, that feel like they don't have a stake, that nation is in trouble. It begins to quake. Its legitimacy is consistently questioned. When people have a stake, when they have a buy-in, wow, it's different. You're beginning to have the whole choir singing.
Thank you.
I have another question, if I may.
Yeah.
Why, we at least and we've seen it in Kansas and other places, the outrage over the possibility, theoretical possibility, of an illegal immigrant or someone from Colorado illegally voting and canceling out your vote. And I don't see that outrage when there's a story about, an 80-year-old person who can't find their birth certificate and they end up not being able to vote. Maybe Jim can comment too. Is it just the language that is used that makes it sound so much? Because it's the same difference. There's a vote, the second you could argue is worse because an American was disenfranchised, and yet the outrage seems to be more about the first. And I just wonder if you have any idea why that is. Is it language, or is it just this idea of this other coming in? I would think people would be pretty upset if a 80-year-old woman can't vote, but I just don't see that same passion, I guess.
Right. So, and I think part of it deals, and Jim, jump in here with me. I think part of it deals with the xenophobia that has been embedded in the American narrative for so long. That it is the threat of an immigrant coming in, pretending to be an American and stealing what is rightfully an American's job, an American's role, an American's right. And it's that threat that has been so embedded in the ways that this nation has culturally produced images. I mean, it's the threat that we saw with the Chinese. It was the threat with the Japanese. It was the threat. And so it allows them to tap into a horrific vein in American society. Whereas, so in Ohio, in one of those massive purges, for instance, that happened, one of the people caught in those purges and who took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court was a Navy veteran. Now, you think that the way that we honor our veterans, right? And I'm an Army brat. So the way that we honor our veterans, that the fact that this veteran would be removed from the role simply because he hadn't voted in a couple of federal elections, that should have caused outrage.
I was just gonna chime in. I think exactly along with what you're saying, Carol. It's the reinforcement of the message that you hear more often. So if you have a president of the United States saying, "Look at this band of people trying to come in and invade our southern border," the narrative of an immigrant trying to cast an illegal vote or something like that seems to make sense with that. Whereas the other case seems more like the exception, the not happening very often because we don't hear it. And so it doesn't have as much appearance of truth, even if it just makes your blood boil when it happens. Yeah.
Right.
So in your book, you do the great job of the history and then kind of the demystifying of the way in which voter suppression is done today under the guise of race neutrality. And then I really appreciated the inclusion of the chapters on resistance and kind of warrior up.
Yes.
And I just really, I think that's an important kind of part of the story. And it's not just this one part, it's kind of the resistance. And I just kind of wonder maybe kind of where do you think we stand at this moment in terms of that resistance, kind of after the summer of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement? It seems to me there's been a kind of real mobilization. I was just kind of thinking about, the NBA players sitting down and then forcing the owners of the teams to open up the stadiums and the marinas and LeBron James recruiting 50,000 pool workers across the country. It seems to be there's this real kind of mass movement that the summer, and really it's taken on a real kind of important role in kind of the resistance in what's going on right now.
I agree. And I think that, and we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, I think a lot of what we're seeing, a major part of what we're seeing is that with COVID-19, that has really exposed everybody's vulnerability. And then with so many being forced to be inside at home, doing everything at home, you've got the TV on and you see that awful 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Shortly before that, there was the lynching, for all intents and purposes, of Ahmaud Arbery here in Georgia. And then, so we begin to see the kind of violence that African Americans had been talking about for so long. But because we're in the house, we see it too. Kind of like the way it was in the civil rights movement, when you see what is happening at the sit-ins, when you see the buses being firebombed, it's like, wait a minute. Like the Edmund Pettus Bridge, wait a minute. Then I believe that when we then saw, for instance, the 75-year-old white man in Buffalo who was pushed to the ground by police and his head cracked on the sidewalk and blood is coming out of his head. You see blood coming out of his ear, and the police just walk by. The cognitive dissonance between protect and serve and what we had just witnessed is causing this rethinking about the way we do democracy, that everything that we thought was on track looks like it's gone off the rails. And that kind of thinking through, then I believe and when you have a person in the White House who has no respect for democracy, no respect for checks and balances, no, I don't even think he knows what the Constitution actually says at all. It's just not clear when he says, but I have the power to do that. You're like, no, that's Congress's power. So all of that and the shredding of these guardrails has people really thinking through the fragility of democracy and the realization, and this is the piece I love, that we have the power to save this democracy. We have the power to fix it. We have the power to make it better. And that's why I think we saw those massive voter turnouts during the primaries. And here, for instance, our primary got moved from April to June because of the pandemic here in Georgia. By June, the presidential candidates were already secured. You knew it was going to be Trump and you knew it was going to be Biden. The turnout was record-setting. Even though top of the ballot has, people were like, I am voting. And when we're thinking about, what's it, 21 million people have already voted now. This is people basically taking off their Clark Kent glasses and getting in that phone booth and going to save democracy. So here in Georgia, we have had lines for early voting up to 11 hours. Now, people should not have to wait in line 11 hours to vote. And people said, I will, because I must, because I'm voting like our lives depend on it. And that is the warrioring up. That is the people fighting to save this democracy that is imperiled. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. This has been great. Any final closing comments that you would send us with, other than this warrioring up? We're ready for that part. Anything else that we need to do?
And I just think it's making sure that not only you, but your friends and your family have a plan, are registered to vote and have a plan for voting. If you're voting by absentee ballot, you know the rules. If you're voting early voting, you know the rules and you know where you're supposed to go. If you're voting on election day, you know you're supposed to go, and the lines will probably be really long. So bring a bottle of water or two, something to eat, your cell phone, a battery pack, charger, and know that if something goes off the rails, call 1-866-OUR-VOTE. That is from the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. It is their election protection hotline. So that if something's going off the rails, if you know you're registered to vote and all of a sudden they're saying you're not on the rolls, you can get help. If somebody's coming up to you, intimidating you at the polls, you can get help, because that intimidation is illegal. And vote. That is what this American democracy is about. That is what we fought for. When you think about it, when this nation was founded, so much of what makes America America is that we have fought on the aspirational plane of what America says it wants to be. And that is how you have seen this incredible growth of this nation. And so we're fighting to make America America. Believe in that aspiration and go into that ballot booth. Ballot booth? Go into your polling station and fully participate in this democracy. And then it doesn't stop with the vote. We must hold our elected officials accountable. That's how we get the democracy we deserve. That's how we get a democracy where we have this big, thick songbook and sopranos and altos and tenors and baritones and basses are singing, and it is beautiful. That's how we get there.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible hour. Thank you so much for your telling of the history in a way that help us understand its application to the right now, and for giving us that charge to participate in this democracy that we hope to have. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Beatty. Thank you, Mr. Hageman. Thank you, Dr. Schnoebelen. I want to especially thank again the Washburn University student government for sponsoring this important and very timely conversation. Before we close and say goodnight, Dr. Anderson, could you repeat one more time the 1866 vote, should people have any problems with their casting their
Yes.
ballot?
Absolutely. 1866 our OUR vote.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Because you know how hard it is to remember all those numbers, but 1866 our vote. Yes.
Thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.